You may be seated.
Children, you can make your way to this door here. Kids in grades K through 2. All right. Mike Silva, in his book, Would You Like Fries With That?, tells the story of being inside of the airplane cockpit. You would hear the co-pilot or captain say V1 as the plane takes off. So what's V1? V1 is the point of no return for an airplane. You see, they decide this based on the plane's weight and the speed and the temperature and all of this stuff. But once the pilot hits that point, there's no going back. He cannot abort takeoff. This morning in the story of Ruth, we're getting to this place in the story where Ruth is making a V1 commitment. She's going for it. And once she goes for it, there's a point of no return here. And that's where we are in the story this morning. But before we dive into today's text and into today's story, I want to take just a few minutes and kind of pull us all up to speed on where we are in this story. I remember last week a couple of you said, I didn't know how you were going to preach a whole sermon on the first 5 verses of Ruth. And we kind of landed on those first 5 verses. Those are kind of 5 verses that we often tend to read very quickly and kind of just fly over, and so that we can get to kind of the good part of the story, right? But it's interesting. This week I met with a Bible study group on Wednesday afternoon. And we're going through the book of Ruth, and we thought we would watch this movie produced about the book of Ruth. It's a 90-minute movie, and we were going to break it up into 3 30-minute segments. And it's interesting that the first 30 minutes of this movie was the first 5 verses of Ruth. So they spent a third of the story on those first 5 verses. So it made me feel a little bit better about how we're doing this sermon series, because this is where we are this morning. But if you remember last week, we're just kind of going back and reviewing this just a bit this morning. Last week, we discovered that the story is about this woman named Naomi. You remember that? And she and her husband Elimelech leave Bethlehem, and they go to this place called Moab because there's a famine in the land. Well, life gets bad for Naomi in Moab. Do you remember the story? First of all, she has to relocate. When she gets there, at some point in time, her husband dies. She's a single mom, left with these 2 sons, and then things get even more desperate for her. First of all, her sons marry Moabite women that would not have been preferable for a good Israelite. And then, not only do they marry Moabite women, but the women that they marry are barren. So Naomi has no grandkids, and her sons have no children. Now, infertility is a tough thing in our culture today. It can cause a lot of pain. But in this culture, it was especially painful because your whole identity was wrapped up in your descendants and your ability to create descendants. And so this has been a horrible thing for Ruth and Orpah and Naomi. And you think, well, gosh, it seems like life is really going downhill for them. And it even goes more downhill because then Naomi's 2 sons die. Not one, but both of them pass away. And so here we have Naomi left with her 2 daughters-in-law. And if we understand this culture, we understand that to be a widow in this culture is not just a sad thing, it is economically a tragic thing, isn't it? Because widows have no way to make a living. Women, in fact, have no way of making a living. They can only survive because of a man in their life. And so we have 3 women with no men at this point in the story. Life has dealt Naomi a terrible hand. Life is not good for her. And so that's kind of where we landed last week. And this week we're going to pick up with the last verse here, Ruth 1:5. I think this is kind of the key verse where we left off last week. Naomi was left without her husband, or without her 2 sons and her husband. So with this context in mind, we pick up in verse 6 this morning. And so this morning, Kimmy Dahl is going to come and read for us. And some of you may not know Kimmy. Kimmy recently graduated from mine and Christy's alma mater in Virginia, and she has moved to Muncie. She's working on a master's degree at Ball State, so we have that in common with Kimmy. But I've asked her to come and read this morning. This is kind of a long text, so follow along in your Bibles and then leave it open as we study this together. Ruth 1, chapter 6, verse 6 through 22.
When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
All right, thank you, Kimmy. Imagine this scene with me for a moment here. 3 widows living together in Moab. Now, without a man, economic stability was impossible for them. In fact, I'm not really sure how they were getting by. Perhaps neighbors and friends were bringing stuff by to feed their starving stomachs, you think? I'm not sure how they were getting by. But we read in verse 6 that Naomi gets word that things improve in Bethlehem. Look at verse 6 with me. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Now, again, let me make this point again. I made it last week and I'll make it again. The story's really about who? It's about Naomi, you see here. So Naomi's getting word. In fact, Ruth's name is only mentioned once up until this point. Naomi gets word that things are better in her homeland, that there's food available for them, and so what are they going to do? They're going to go back. Now, I'm not sure what Naomi knew about her homeland at this point in time, but she felt like we've got a better chance to survive there than we do here. So she packs up everything, and notice that at least initially, Ruth and Orpah, the 2 daughter-in-laws, are packing their stuff up too, right? They're planning on going with her. So they plan to make the trip, and they head back to Bethlehem. They're in Moab, they're heading back to Bethlehem. Now remember, how far is Moab and Bethlehem? It's about a week's journey, about 70 to 90 miles. In that day and time, it would have taken you about a week to make the hike, if you will. And so you're not talking about just going over to the next town. You're talking about a substantial journey here. Now, notice also in the text here that they understand that God is the one providing the food in Bethlehem. Look at what it says there. They heard that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So God is the one who is working here. God is the one who, even though it seems like in Naomi's life that he's not in control, he is in control, right? He's still doing stuff. He's still working. And I want to point out one more word that you can't see in the English text, but it's the word shuv in Hebrew. In fact, the word shuv, which means to return or to turn, often it's even translated as repent. This word shuv is used 12 times in today's text. You got that? 12 times we see the word shuv. So if we were studying this in Hebrew, it would stick out to us. Wow, that word's in there a bunch of times. Shuv, shuv, shuv. Return, return, return. So in essence, I think the author of Ruth is giving us a hint here. Obviously, some of these turns or returns have to do with going back and forth between two places geographically, but there's also an underlying message here, isn't there? That God is turning things around here. Right? God is in the process. It seems like he's not there. It seems like for Naomi, God has abandoned her. But in reality, God is in the process of turning things around here. So that's the message that we're getting here in this text. God is working. God is moving behind the scenes, okay? We don't see him at this point. Naomi doesn't see him working at this point, but God is working. And so we see that here in this first place. Now, we're not sure how far along the road they get. I mean, they may be 2 days down the road. They may be a half a day down the road. They may be 4 days down the road. We're not sure. But at some point in time, Naomi has a change of heart. Maybe she's just considering what life is going to be like for them when they get back to Bethlehem. And we read in verse 8, "Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you have shown to your dad and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband.'" So Naomi's thinking, life's not going to be too good for these 2 girls once we get back in Bethlehem. Number one, they're Moabites, right? They're foreigners. Maybe she's thinking, that nobody's going to marry these 2 women in Bethlehem. Nobody's going to want to marry a Moabitess, right? She's thinking, I didn't want my sons to marry him, and nobody else is going to marry him, right? And she's thinking, perhaps life will be better for them if they go back to their parents' house. And if they would find, look what it says here, find rest in the home of another husband. Again, we've got to remember, for a woman in this culture, it wasn't that she could just get a job somewhere at Starbucks and start working, and make some money and survive. It wasn't like that. She had to have a man. And if she didn't have a man, she was likely going to starve to death. And so Naomi's thinking if she can go home, she can find rest. The word rest here is often translated ease. For a woman to find another husband would be rest for her. So that's what's going on here. And so Naomi has this change of heart. And we know also, you're going, I wonder what's going on back in Moab. Ruth's parents still alive? Are Orpah's parents still alive? Do they still have contact with them? And we read in Ruth chapter 2, if we fast forward a little bit, we read Boaz saying to Ruth, I've been told about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you, left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people that you did not know before. So we get a clue here that Ruth's parents are still alive. She left them. She could have gone back to them. It would have been culturally acceptable for her to return to her father and mother and wait on another man to marry her. And we understand this could have happened with Ruth, but this is not what happens, and we're going to see here in just a few minutes. Now, this scene here that's taking place somewhere on the road to Judah, we don't know where it's taking place, is a pretty emotional and dramatic scene. First of all, Naomi is struggling with this thing here. Look at verse 9 here. Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you and your people." Now, think about this for a minute. They're family, aren't they? They've been living together. They've suffered tragedy together, haven't they? They've dealt with the loss of loved ones together. They've been surviving in this culture that is hostile to women. And they've been starving possibly together. But they're family. They love each other. And the girls don't want to leave Naomi, do they? They want to stick with her. So Naomi's dealing with this tension. They should go back. No, I don't want them to go back. They should go back, but I really don't want them to go back. And the girls are dealing with this tension. I want to stay with Naomi, but I know life will probably be better if I go back, you see. And so dealing with this tension, and we have this tension here in the text. We read in verse 11, "But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me?'" I just want to stop there in the text a minute. I think that's a key point in the text, isn't it? Why would you come with me? There is nothing for these girls to gain by going with Naomi. They have everything to gain back home, at least a chance. But going with Naomi, there's no reason. And then Naomi gives us some insight here in the text into how things worked in this culture and in this time. Look at what she says. "Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, and then gave birth to sons, why would you wait until would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It's more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." You see, we're getting some insight here into how life worked in this culture. Here's the deal. I've said this and I'll say it again. The women had no chance of succeeding economically on their own. You couldn't say, "I'm just going to be single and I'm going to kind of live life." You had to have a man if you're a woman. And so what would happen is if a man died, his brother would often marry the widow of his brother. You see how that works out. Why would they do that? They would do that so that the woman then would be taken into the home of the brother, would be protected, would be provided for, would have food on her table. And in fact, if the brother impregnated the widow, that child was considered the child of the deceased man. You see, that's how it worked out. And then that child, especially if that child were a son, would then carry on the family name. You see, that's how it would work out. And what's Naomi saying here? Naomi's saying here, look, I'm too old to have any more kids, okay? There's no brother to marry you. And in fact, even if I had a husband, even if I had a child, would you wait around until that child grew up? In fact, by that time, you wouldn't be able to have kids, right? That's probably what she's implying there. There's no chance with me, Naomi says. There's no benefit for you to go with me to Bethlehem. We see that here in the text. So we keep reading. Look at verse 13. "No, my daughters," she says, it is for me, it is more bitter for me than for you because of the Lord's hand. In other words, it's worse for me, Naomi says. It's bitter, and we're going to see that word in just a minute here. Naomi feels like God is against her, doesn't she? She feels like, God's abandoned her. I mean, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you if you had to move and relocate somewhere because of famine, and then your husband dies, and then your husband's wives are barren, and then your 2 sons die? Wouldn't you feel like God had abandoned you? Wouldn't you wonder if God even cared anymore? Wouldn't you wonder if you were somehow cursed by God? That's what Naomi feels like. She says, the Lord is against me. His hand has gone out against me. And Naomi says here this word bitter. In a few minutes we're going to see in the text where Naomi says, you know what? Call me bitter. That's my new name, in other words. But the word bitter is an interesting word here. And we see it here in the text. And she says here, no, my daughters, it is more bitter for me. That's the word mara in Scripture. And it has to do with suffering. It has to do with hard times. It's a word of lament. I want to show you some other places in Scripture that this word is used. And I think it'll give us an idea of what this word means. We see it in the story of Jacob and Esau, when Esau realizes that his birthright has been taken by Jacob. Genesis chapter 27. When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, bless me to my father. He had loud and what? Mara, bitter cry. Esau is distraught, isn't he? He's suffering because his birthright has been taken. We also see this word in the story of Hannah. Do you remember that story? Hannah wanted to bear a son. And it says in 1 Samuel chapter 1, in Mara, bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. The pain of not being able to bear a child for Hannah was Mara. It was bitter. We also see this word in the book of Job. We see it 4 times in the book of Job. Now, I won't bore you by reading every single verse for you this morning, but I will show you one verse in Job chapter 7. Job says, therefore I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the Mara, bitterness of my soul. You see what that word means? It's bitter. It's Esau losing his birthright. It's Hannah unable to bear a son. It's Job being afflicted with all sorts of suffering. It's bitter. And Naomi says, I am bitter now because of all that has happened to me. It's a word of lament. Now, back to the story here. Naomi is persistent, and Orpah finally decides to heed Naomi's advice in verse 14. At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. Now, Orpah finally says, okay, I'm with you. I think it's better for me to go. And she heads off for greener pastures back in Moab. Now, the scene is emotional here. And I'm sure that, we read it quickly, but I'm sure it probably lasted for quite some time here with them weeping and clinging to each other. And finally, Orpah breaks away and leaves. But Ruth does not. Now, look, Naomi continues to plead with Ruth in verse 15. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. Now, do you see it in the text? Your sister-in-law is going back to her, what? Her people and her gods. It's interesting here. This is part of the story. This is part of the text we need to understand. That the nation of Moab, the territory, the tribal land, is linked with the god of Shamash, okay? As Israel is linked with Yahweh, okay? So if Ruth would have decided to go back to Moab, she would also be returning to her gods. So her connection with Naomi, her going with Naomi, is not just Naomi, it is Naomi and her God. Okay, so this is part of the story. Ruth is choosing not just to go with her mother-in-law, she's also choosing to follow Yahweh, isn't she? She's also choosing to for all that God has been to her, she's saying, I'm with you, God. I'm going with you, God. Now, I think you could build the case that Naomi and God have not been good for Ruth up until this point. Wouldn't you say? I don't know what life was like in Moab for her before Naomi came along and before she met her son and married her son. But once she was married, life was not good for her. She was barren. She was unable to bear a son. That would have been tragic for her. It would have been much, much pain for her. And then her husband dies. Life has not been good for Ruth. Life has not been good for her since she started following Naomi's God. But regardless, she is choosing to follow anyways. The word here for clung is the word debak. It means that she is loyal. She is sticking with Naomi no matter what. I want to kind of look at this here because I think this is what we're getting at here in the text. This is what the story is telling us at this point. Ruth is going with Naomi not because she knows what's going to happen. She didn't know she's going to meet Boaz. She didn't know that she is going to be in the line of the Messiah. She didn't know any of that stuff at this point. She's simply going with Naomi because she's following Naomi and she's following God. And in many ways, Ruth's act here is totally selfless, isn't it? It's totally laying herself down. It's totally like, I'm giving up everything in order to follow you, God. Do you remember Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 10? I want to show you this because I think what Ruth is doing here, she is modeling her descendant, Jesus, right? She's modeling what it means to live in the gospel here. Jesus said this, and this saying of Jesus is recorded 5 different times in Scripture. Whoever finds his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What's Ruth doing? She's giving up her life, isn't she? She's giving up all possibility of finding rest in the home of another man. And she's like, Naomi, I'm going with you. I'll die with you if you die. Your God is going to be my God. And I'm not in this for what I'm going to get out of it. I'm in it because I want to be faithful and I want to follow. Jesus also said this in Mark chapter 10, I tell you the truth, no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and for the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, and with them persecutions. That's interesting, isn't it? And in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. You know, I think we got to maintain some balance here, because Jesus does promise here that we will be repaid for what we give up, right? So we understand that, and we can't totally hide that from the picture here. But at the same time, it's about giving up, isn't it? And Ruth at this point in time isn't giving up because of what she's going to get. You see, she's willing to give up even if she doesn't get, right? That's what's going on here. You know, in recent years, there's been a movement among churches, and I think it's a noble movement in the sense that I think people want to see those who are far from Christ come to know Christ. And many churches have kind of changed the message of the gospel in order to attract people into the church. And some churches have removed all the crosses from their churches because crosses are offensive and we don't want to offend anybody. Some churches have said, you know, we need to really preach more about helping people, you know, have financial success or raise their children or have healthy marriages, and we need to talk about that stuff more. And, you know, those are noble things. Those are good things. We do need to have those, right? We need to teach people those things. But in the effort of doing this, I'm afraid that we have changed the message of the gospel to something like Jesus will help you. He'll benefit you. He'll make your life better if you'll just follow Him. But the gospel, and at the heart of the gospel, is the message that we are all called to give our lives away. Right? And I think we have to be careful here not to lose this component of the gospel. You know, the first part, the way where we say Jesus will benefit and help you, you know, you get a lot of people down the aisle that way. But you start telling people that you're going to lose your life, you're going to suffer if you follow Jesus, you know, there's not a lot of takers there. But that's the message, isn't it? That's the gospel, isn't it? And this is what Ruth is modeling for us here in this text. She's saying, Naomi, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to follow your God, even if it costs me everything. Even if I starve to death. I'm going to starve to death in Bethlehem with you, with your God. And that's the message of the text this morning. It is a powerful message here, and we must not lose sight of that. Finally, in verse 18, Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her. And she said, okay, you're in. And she stopped urging her. Ruth and Naomi make their way to Bethlehem in verse 19. The two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. Again, we don't know how far that would have been. But when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Isn't that interesting that the town is stirred because of them? Why is the town stirred? Why are they stirred because Naomi's there? Some people say, well, it's because Ruth's with her, and Ruth's a Moabitess, and Ruth's a foreigner, and they can't figure out why a foreigner's coming into Bethlehem with Naomi. I think that it is because Naomi has drastically changed in the years. She left, married, and with 2 sons. You know, life is probably good for her. She's probably younger. She's probably happier. She had not experienced the suffering of losing a husband, of losing 2 kids. And she comes back into town, and there's no Elimelech, there's no Mahlon and Chilion, and there's this woman with her, a Moabitess. I think that probably Naomi's physical appearance was different. She was older, but not just older. She probably has a lot more wrinkles due to the stress she'd been through. She probably wasn't very healthy because she's probably close to starving to death by this time. And they look at her and they go, who is that woman? Somebody says, hey, I think it's Naomi. Naomi? Elimelech's wife? Yeah, that's her. Are you sure? Doesn't even look like her. Can you hear the women talking? Oh, wow, what's she done with her hair, you know? What's she wearing, you know? And so that's the line. That's what's that. That's the stirring that we hear here. And so all of a sudden, the women see her come into town. And when they see her come into town, they're talking about her. They're not sure it's her. And again, look at the text here. Is this Naomi? And how does Naomi respond here? Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. That's that word, bitter. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Again, there's that word, bitter, the word we talked about earlier. Naomi says, you know what? My new name is bitter. Just call me that, because my life stinks. In fact, God has cursed me, she says. God's afflicted me. Very, very similar to Job here, isn't it? Same sort of language that Job uses here. Little does she know what God is doing, right? I mean, God is, and again, back to that word, shuv, God is turning things around. Little does Naomi know what God is about to do. Little does Ruth know what God is about to do. But He's working behind the scenes. And when He seems like He's far away, He's close by. And then verse 22 kind of closes out this scene for us. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. That's a scene. And it fades out right there for today. Next week, Matt's going to be preaching. He's going to pick up the story right where we left off. But this morning, I want to get back into just this part of the text, and I want to ask the question, what does it mean for us today? When we read this story, what does it mean for us? Now, you probably heard this text read at weddings, haven't you? Anybody ever heard it at a wedding? I have. And a lot of times you don't hear the context. And you know, strangely enough, we apply it to a husband and a wife, but the original context is between a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law. That's pretty crazy, isn't it? But that's what happens here. And the context is in this story. Now, I agree, in a marriage there is the same sort of self-sacrifice that Ruth has. We need to have in marriages, and so it is an appropriate text for the marriages. But what does it mean for you and I today? And I think that the bottom line is this: that Ruth follows Naomi and her God, even though it cost her everything, and we got to remember that. She exhibits the characteristics of Jesus, modeling Jesus. The same sort of posture that Jesus had, right? Jesus gave Himself up for us, didn't He? He didn't do it because of what He would gain. He did it for you and for me. And Ruth is doing the same thing for Naomi. And we live in a world, don't we, that's about getting. You think about that for a minute. We live in a world where we believe that we are the center of the universe and the world revolves around us, don't we? We live in a world where we want to know if we're going to sacrifice for something, that we got to have payoff, right? If we're going to sacrifice, what are we going to get out of this? That's most of the time the question that we ask. Why do we do this? Because life is about us, right? The world revolves around us. But in the story of Ruth, we see loyalty. We see a steadfast spirit. We see faithfulness. We see a willingness to give up everything in order to stick with God. As we close this morning, Eric Paley is going to come and share a story. Jim, I think it was you were planning this with Matt, weren't you? Or didn't you do the worship planning with Matt around this? And Jim and Matt were talking about this text weeks ago. they had the idea that it would be cool for someone to come and share the story, to think even in terms of a church family and what it means to be a family in the church, and to stick with each other even when times are tough. And Eric's going to share his story a little bit this morning, and then we're going to close together.
Good morning. I was asked to share with you about my struggles with our church when it was going through some hard times that, some of you were here when those were going on and some of you weren't. I think it's important for you all to know that this is my first home church ever. I didn't grow up going to church. We went a couple times on Christmas and a couple times on Easter, but it just wasn't a big deal in my family. I didn't start really going to church very faithfully until I started dating my current wife, Stacy. And it was, if I wanted to visit her on a Sunday, I had to go to church. And I thought, hey, I can give up 2 or 3 hours on a Sunday to get to spend a whole other day with her. So that's when I first started going to church. As we dated, I slowly, God began to chip away at me, and I began to see the real picture and not the picture I had grown up with and kind of thought in my own head. Before we got married, we decided we really needed to find a home church, and we visited a couple churches. One of them was this one. We walked in the door here one Sunday. This was our church, and we never visited another church after that. It was about January 2004, right before we started doing, some of you may remember the 30 Days of Purpose, the Rick Warren study that we did. We met in small groups in people's houses. We had our small group and then the sermon related to it. I was even traveling a lot for work, but I made it home every weekend so we could have our small group and so I could come to church. Because, I was just starting to grow then. I think that, wrong page. When we started coming here, we knew that there had been some trouble in the church. I was talking to Bill Itzen, and he likes to call them the worship wars. They had just recently went to 2 services to have a contemporary and a traditional service. They had this fancy praise band that had instruments on the stage. They had fought over the times of the services. It was years, and we still heard about the screen that's up there. It was just a really contentious time. And it was shortly after all this that Woody had left. He was the pastor. This was the guy that baptized me. This was the guy that I sat and learned a lot from. This is the guy that there were 4 or 5 men in a group who met every week with Woody on Wednesday evenings that he had picked that he thought would be future leaders of the church. And we met for a couple hours in a small group. This guy meant a lot to me. Unfortunately, for me, he meant a lot more for me than that this church meant for me. And when he left, it was difficult for me. It was hard. I think I made the mistake that some early Christians do of looking more towards the pastor as opposed to looking to the church as a church family. And I think that took me some time to realize that. We did have a great interim pastor, Maynard Hatch, who was here for 2.5, 3 years. I will admit, I really struggled during those 2.5 or 3 years. I didn't really get what I needed out of church. Things started falling away. We didn't have our small groups. We didn't really get together outside of church. I just really didn't feel like I was being fed. And I do think Maynard was very important. He needed to say some things to the church that most pastors couldn't get away with saying. He had some things to tell us that we needed to hear so that we could grow up and realize, hey, we are a family. We're not a first service. We're not a second service. We're not this. We're not that. We're a church family, and we need to realize that. During this time, my wife and I did have a lot of conversations about, are we going to stay? Are we going to go? Are you getting anything from church? Are you not? What are you doing? We both really felt, we're just going through the motions. We're coming to church because we're supposed to on Sunday. We're going to Sunday school because we're supposed to. And then we're really seeking things outside of church. But we decided, hey, we are going to see what happens. We don't want to just jump ship. During that time, it really shows, Jim and Irene took us out to dinner one night at Chili's, which they may not even remember that they did. But they talked with us and they said, hey, we want you to do what you think is best for you. They knew that we were struggling. They knew us enough to know and loved us enough to know to come and talk to us. And that really showed us a lot. There are 2 couples in this church. Dan and Ella May are one of the reasons we're here. They took us in. Hey, you're coming Wednesday night. You're going to sit at our table and we're going to introduce you to everybody. These were 2 couples that really loved us and showed us that this church could be a family for us. And then, like I said, my wife and I had these discussions. Shortly after we made that final decision, we're going to stick it out, see what happens until we get a new pastor. Within a couple months of that, they form a search committee, and guess who's on the search committee? My wife is. To me, it's just one of those things. It's God saying, we wanted you here. Eric, you needed to grow up and realize these things. Now let's see what's going to happen. And Wade was called, and I'd met Wade a few times and definitely thought, oh, this guy's awesome. This guy's cool. I could really get into this. And I started to do the exact same thing. Hey, Wade's awesome. Church is cool, but Wade's awesome. His sermons are just phenomenal. And I caught myself doing this. And I think that what I've realized is, one of the greatest gifts that Wade gives us is not his sermons. I mean, don't get me wrong, he does a great job. But I think the best thing he has done for us is to look at us and go, okay, you guys need to be involved. There's life groups, there's small groups, there's different committees. You need to be involved because you're a family. Like it or not, you guys live as a family, you grow as a family, you suffer as a family. And I think that's going to be his lasting legacy here. And I mean, it just really helps me to look. I look back and I think, they had these worship wars started before we came to church, and for 3 or 4 years, people were still talking about them. I think back about when we had to make that difficult move to go to a more volunteer staff. We didn't take it great, but we took it a lot better than we could have. And I think that just goes to show, as a church, how much we have matured as a family. There were people that were happy, people that weren't, but we treated it like a family. And I think that says a lot about our congregation and how much it has grown. I think that that's something that Wade has helped do, that's Maynard helped do, that's something that God has brought these men in to our church to help. I think that it's going to help us, because there's going to be change in the future. It's going to happen someday where Wade's called to go somewhere else. And I think it's important that we stick together as a family so when those changes do happen, that we don't take a step back to what we were before. I think that's what we can really learn as a church from going through this experience. I think that, I think we're on the right path. I think we've all grown. I know I definitely have grown. I'm a completely different person than I was when I walked in the door in January 2004. So I think that the struggle that I've had here and the struggle that we've had as a church family has really just drawn us all closer together. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric, for comparing the family that Ruth would have been a part of with Naomi to our church family. And I think that's a great point, that we stick with each other through thick and thin. And we see that in Ruth, don't we? We see that in Jesus. It's part of the gospel, isn't it? That we give and give up rather than what we receive or benefit. Let's take a few minutes this morning and respond to whatever God's saying to you this morning. Maybe this morning you would want to come and join this family, and now would be the time that you would come down and do that. Maybe this morning you'd like to come and just kneel at the altar and pray. Maybe you would pray from wherever you're standing. Whatever way that God is prompting you to respond, let's all stand together and do that as we sing.